Welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show, issue number 76.
Boom!
Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show, issue number 76. And we got a big one today. And before we go into it, now give us the insight of what we need to do, and the people out there got to do something for us, right?
That's right, everyone. You know what to do on the Pop XP network. Make sure to look below, click that subscribe button, and smash that bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome content. And John, I'm happy to be streaming with you tonight. We've been on about a 4-week hiatus, I believe it's been. You know, getting shows, but we got some guests lined up, and I'm pumped for it.
Absolutely. Hey, some people come and go, but we try to keep consistent as we can. And we got cons and all that stuff to do. You know, we're people that do stuff right now, right, Steve? We're people that got stuff to do. But
that's right.
What I do love is I love when we make Steve as happy as his protein pancakes he likes to have, nice and thick, right, Steve? With this pecan syrup all over that stuff.
Yes.
I like. Steve.
Is that the Sunday ritual? Is that what that is there, Steve? You
yes,
take yourself on a date?
Pecan syrup.
Pecan?
Yeah.
And but what I do love is when we make our boy Steve over here happy, when we got a guest that really means something to his heart. Now, people out there should know, as crazy as we are about comics, Steve likes the details, the references, how he got so obsessed and why he's such a good Overstreet advisor and all this. Steve, tell him your little history and why our guest today is so important to you. Take it away, brother.
I am more than excited tonight. I mean, I've been just on edge all day because one of my personal heroes is on the show tonight. When I was a young kid and learning my way around the Marvel Universe, I had no collection, so I needed information. I needed reference material. And I was just at the right age at the right time when Marvel published the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. And when I would look through the names, Mr. Peter Sanderson's name was there, along with, Mark Grunwald and all those guys. And then, so I was always enamored with these. I would think of them as gods, these guys that somehow knew all this material, had access to all this material, had all these collections, had read them 100 times. There I was in the 1980s just beginning. So those guys were able to open up the door for me to open up Pandora's box. And so I was able to read Peter Sanderson's work. And even today, I think it still holds up as the finest reference work also today. What was it, 35 years? Is it 40 years? Oh, my God. Here we are, and I'm finally going to end up speaking with Peter Sanderson.
Yeah, Steve, a lot of your work is based on, is kind of in the vein of his work. You love, I know how your head, with those indexes and all those little intricacies, first appearance, because that was very radical for the time, and then even reading the Marvel Saga at the time, people think people in comics today don't understand how easy it is to get information. But back then when we were kids, getting that information was kind of hard. And when you got something, it was like a Pandora's box. It was like, oh my God, like it's this, it's that. I got to get this issue. And this man, Mr. Sanderson, his work was so essential to people like us that like it was so meticulous, and that's how we are. And when I read your little Overstreet stuff, it reminds me of Peter Sanderson's work, Steve. It's also I'm just saying it's so meticulous. It's so, and I can see. And the thing is, Steve, they got to edit you because you could write page after page. You could keep going. You could keep going. Am I right?
I could get a little carried away.
Yeah, but that's why you're so good at it. So without any further ado, now why don't we bring out the man, Mr. Peter Sanderson, historian extraordinaire.
Hello, thank you.
Welcome, welcome.
Welcome, Mr. Sanderson.
Glad to be here.
Well, first off, you got all those books behind you, and I'm sure that's just a pathway into your head of all the...
Yes, it is. That's what I think. And you're only seeing two of the bookcases here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 9 of them. And stacked to the ceiling with books. And yes, I'd say that at least half of this collection is comics related.
Very nice. Your own personal library.
It is. It's a year's worth. It's a lifetime's worth of accumulating books, and I think it's like a key. Someone who looked through that would see a key to how my mind works. All of my different interests.
I love that.
So Peter, while we're into it, like, why don't you tell us first, like, little Peter Sanderson when he was a little spry boy? Tell us your origins into comics, like some of the first comics you saw, and how'd you get so wrapped up into it?
Okay, well, first of all, I've been reading comics as long as I can remember. I used to live, when I was a small child, this is like kindergarten age, I lived in a town called Scituate in Massachusetts, where you're from.
Oh, I know where that is, yeah.
And it's on the South Shore, it's on the coast.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
There was a mom and pop store there where my mother would take me down there and I'd get comics. Now, back then, they were Dell comics that I was buying. And I remember later on, the family moved to Milton, which is just south of Boston. And I'm still reading comics. But at that point, around like 1960, all the things that I used to read from Dell Comics were now Gold Key Comics. And even back then, I had a favorite artist and favorite writer. And I didn't know they were the same person. I didn't know they were Carl Barks, but I knew this was the best stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that even before I discovered Uncle Scrooge, my favorite comic, I think, was The Fox and the Crow from DC, and nobody knows what that is anymore.
No.
But anyway, so I think it was like maybe 64, 65 that I bought and read my first superhero comic, which is an issue of World's Finest by Edmund Hamilton, introducing the composite Superman. And the back,
oh, yeah.
and Superman, Batman versus the composite Superman, and the backup was a reprint. Didn't know it was a reprint at the time. It was Superman versus the Flame Dragon from Krypton. And Kurt Swan drew the first story, and Wayne Boring drew the backup, and I was hooked. And then I started reading all the Superman family of comics. And then in early 66, I already knew who Batman was from World's Finest. In early 66, I was hearing about the coming Batman TV show.
Yeah.
So I bought my first issue of a Batman comic, which had a Gil Kane cover. Didn't know it was Gil Kane at the time. Of showing the Riddler, who by coincidence or not, was the first villain on the Batman TV show. So I was hooked on Batman. Yeah. I said, well, who is this editor Julie Schwartz guy? And so in the fall, I started buying his other books. And in the fall of 66, also, we had the original Marvel Superheroes animated TV show. which had basically minimal animation. It was basically just pictures with their mouths moving. But the stories were all taken from the comics, and the art they were using with the moving mouths all came from the comics too. So I was seeing, again, without knowing their names, people like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko on screen. So I started buying Marvel comics. And soon after that, I started writing letters to Julie Schwartz's letters pages. And to my astonishment, he started printing them. And I was really one of like the top 4 or 5 letter writers in his pages, letters pages in the 60s. It's me, Guy Lillian III, Irene Vartanov, who's now a friend of mine, Mike Friedrich, me, and maybe Bob Vosakis came in a little later. And I started writing to the Marvel books as well, but they didn't print me as much. So that's sort of phase 1 of how I got into comics. The next, when I sort of got tired of DC towards the end of the 60s. No, towards the end of the 60s, because that's when like Gardner Fox and John Broome and a lot of the writers left out of a dispute over money. And I didn't care for their replacements. But then I was still reading Marvels though, and I got back into DC's when I started hearing about the sort of revolutionary work that Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams were doing on Green Lantern and Batman.
Right.
And so when I was in my college years, I was still reading, I was writing, and I was reading a whole lots of comics all the time. Mind you, through this whole period, when I'm in high school, when I'm in college, if my friends knew I was reading comics, they said, but you're too old for this.
Yeah.
But I kept on doing it because I knew this was good. And now I look back and think, well, people like me and others of my age who kept reading the Marvel and DC comics into their teens and 20s, we were visionaries. We knew this stuff was great. We knew, although we couldn't imagine how they would take over like movies and TV decades later.
Right.
So let's see. So I kept on writing letters to comics. And then when I came back, started grad school, I was from the Boston area, but I went to college at Columbia in New York City. So I moved to New York City, and I came back for graduate school, and I've stayed in and around New York ever since. And when I was in grad school, I got a letter from a woman named Bonnie Wilford, who was the letter page editor at Marvel. And she said, well, I really like your letters, and now that you're in New York, I'd like to meet you for lunch. And I'm going to bring along my boyfriend named Chris Claremont. We just started writing the X-Men.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Wow. That's crazy. Wow.
So I had lunch with Chris. This is like, Chris really liked the letters too, but this was like, he had only been writing the X-Men for a year at this point, but I knew this was good.
Yeah.
And through Chris, I started my friendship with Chris and Bonnie, who are no longer attached. That's long ago. Chris is married to someone else now, Beth. Through my friendship with Chris, I got to meet other comic book pros who are my age, or around about my age. So I was reading, so after spending my high school and college years thinking I was the only person my age who was reading superhero comics, except for these people like Irene, who seemed far, far away in these pre-internet days, I was all of a sudden meeting more comics pros than I was comics fans. And this all led at the start of the 80s to Marv Wolfman and Len Wein, who had not met by this point, contacting me and saying, well, we're going to be doing this project called The History of the DC Universe. Oh. And what we need is for somebody to read through the entire DC Comics library and take notes for us.
Oh my word.
How would you like to do this? And I said, well, of course.
Yeah.
because at this point I just finished my graduate studies and looking for something else to do in New York. So at first I only went in twice a week, but it got up to 3 times a week. And I remember at one point Paul Levitz was getting testy about this and saying, well, how long is this going to take? So, but I did it 3 times a week, and it took a year. And I confess that I read anything that was DC Universe connected. So that, no, I didn't read the Jerry Lewis or Bob Hope or Honeymooners comics. I did, however, because there was Captain Carrot, I did feel like I could read the Funny Animal comics.
Oh, yeah.
Unfortunately, they did not have copies of Fox and the Crow, if I remember correctly. But I was reading all this Sheldon Mayer Funny Animal stuff, so hey. And after doing that, now, it ended up that they didn't do the history of the DC Universe for quite a while later. But what this did evolve into was the Who's Who of the DC Universe series.
Yeah.
And since I'd done all this research, I was asked to be write a whole lot of it, as I did. And this in turn led to Mark Grunwald, who I'd met by this point, asked me to. Now, Mark had already asked me to be a writer and assistant editor on his fanzine Omniverse, which was about alternate realities and time travel in DC and Marvel Comics. And from there, he asked me to come in and be one of the writers on the Official Handbook of the Marvel Universe. Now, Mark originally was writing that whole thing himself, but as you can easily imagine, this would prove to be impossible because he had a full-time editor job as well, not to mention the comics he was writing. So I came in, I think, with issue 2, and I just started writing more and more and more of it. And when we did the next 2 versions, I was really the main writer. And it worked out pretty well for me. With the second version, when John commented that Steve could just go on and on writing his Overstreet articles, you'll notice in the first version of Marvel Universe Handbook, nobody got more than 1 page. But on the second version, I got to write entries that went on for 2 or 3 pages. Like if it was someone like Professor X or the Red Skull, who had a really long, involved history. And what I discovered was that, sometimes when I look back on those handbook entries for the second version, where I often was assigned to expand or revise one of Mark's original entries and bring it up to date. Looking back, in many cases, I cannot tell where Mark stops and I began because our styles just melded so perfectly. Although if I can usually guess because there are some characters that I wanted to handle everyone from the X-Men, I wanted to handle everyone from Daredevil, I wanted to handle everyone from Thor. And in those cases, I would also consult with the writers. So I would talk to Chris. I could talk to Walt about Thor. That's where I found out from Frank Miller that he conceived the Kingpin as like a sumo wrestler. That wasn't the fat, that was all muscle. Yeah. And between the first and second versions of the handbook is when Ralph Macchio recommended me to Ann Nocenti to be her assistant. Louise Simonson was editor of the X-Men. She had gone freelance. And Ann was promoted to take over the X books. And Ann, she knows a lot about comics now, but she didn't know anything about comics history, the Marvel characters' history at that point. Didn't know much. So I think that's why Mark and Ralph recommended me. And so I did that for a while. And before I left to do the second version of the handbook and then the Marvel Saga. And it goes on from there. When the actual Marvel projects stopped, and DC projects started running out, that's when, again, on Mark's recommendation, he recommended me to editors at the publishing company, Harry and Abrams, to write a book about Marvel for them. And that's where my series of books that I wrote or co-wrote, and in one case with Roy, started. So that's my origin story, briefly.
And Peter, you also wrote that big Marvel book, right? The 50 years, was that you?
No, 50 Years was before me. That was somebody else. I did the second book, which is Marvel Universe.
Yes, okay. Then yeah, that's right. Because I remember your name, and I could always remember your name at the top of the when you're looking at the handbooks, and I could always remember Peter Sanderson, like, because you're always at the top there, even as a little kid. But
right, because
I was like
the main writer after Merck.
Yeah, hearing your story,
although really after the first version of the handbook, I was the main writer because Mark was just the editor at that point.
Yeah, wow. I hear your story and I see a little embryo of Steve growing and growing, like, he's go. So Steve, go ahead. This is for you.
So, Peter, I was aware that you were able to cram 2 whole universes into your brain. I was never able to cram DC into my brain. I could only concentrate on one universe. I couldn't have 2. So I always tip my hat to someone who can
amazing,
Peter, at that level.
Now, which is not to say, by the way, that I have all this stuff permanently committed to memory. I know, like today on Facebook, Walt Simonson was asking, was there ever a comic book issue in which Batman and Jonah Hex teamed up? And I couldn't think of one because I never made an attempt to memorize that particular fact. So Mark Wade wrote in, of course. It said, "Oh, I know where it was."
I wanted to go back a little bit because I'm sure, that obviously after reading DC for a while and you began reading Marvel, there was something you obviously would have noticed, and that's the tight continuity and connectivity of the Marvel Universe.
Yes.
Now, when did you first discover that? What were the issues were you reading where the coin dropped and you thought, "Oh my word, this is one universe. They're all the same." And what did that do to your reading enthusiasm?
Well, for one thing, I think I'm trying to recall which book, the books that I read when I first started in the fall of '66. Well, for example, the first issue of Avengers I read had Captain America in it, and I knew that Captain America was appearing in Tales of Suspense. And so I think it was a slow, gradual. So I realized these characters are all in the same universe, and I think it was probably a slow realization because Stan just integrated the characters more often than they did at DC. At DC at that time, well, when I first started reading superhero comics, Superman and Batman would pair up in World's Finest, but no other superheroes would show up there. What's the problem? Yeah. And there's the Justice League book, but again, you didn't see superheroes guest star in each other's books apart from that, all Brave and Bold. There were just very limited places at DC where characters would team up. Whereas I think I realized one of the early issues of X-Men, one of the first issues of X-Men I first saw was Spider-Man guest starring with the X-Men. Let me see, Avengers. Trying to think. Roy in his early Avengers issues, he seemed to be like eager to be able to bring in characters that Stan and Jack had done. And so, I mean, there was, in the first year I was reading Avengers, you had Diablo and the Dragon Man showing up from Fantastic Four and Hercules showing up from Thor. So, yeah, I think it was pretty clear to me fairly early on. And not an immediate revelation, but I soon got the feeling that it's all interconnected. But another thing that really made it interconnected was the fact that, when we got to the huge, ongoing, never-ending controversy about Stan and Jack, who is more important? Who did what? Well, what I always think of is when I started reading Marvels in the mid-'60s, it was clear to me from the very start that it was Stan's sensibility that was uniting the entire line of comics.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it had to
And
be,
it was, he wrote most of them, and it was clear to me that the other writers, like Roy and Steranko, were basically doing their variations on Stan.
Oh, of course.
And so it was no surprise, since he was writing and supervising all of the comics, that the characters, heroes would guest star in each other's books. Villains would go from one book to another. I don't think it was that long, maybe not my first year, but I don't think it was that long before, for example, like I found a Fantastic Four annual number 3 where everybody appears.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the Spider-Man annual where Spider-Man tries out to join the Avengers, and the initiation test they give him is to fight the Hulk.
Yeah. Big test.
So yeah, it was, and obviously I had a liking for this. I like the fact that it was all tied together.
Oh, it definitely made it like a family union. And Stan being the overall editor, he had to like, like with Kirby's and Ditko's like panels and storytelling, and then you had Stan Lee obviously being the editor, putting all those other it was so incredible. Let me ask you this, Peter.
And it was clearly Stan's idea to me. It was clearly Stan's idea, because if you look at the series that Kirby did on his own in the 70s at Marvel, Captain America, the Falcon, did you see other superheroes show up or villains from other books? No. Black Panther, did you see heroes or villains from other books? No. Eternals?
No,
well, you saw
not
Hulk.
Yeah, that was
the Kirby
recent
fans are
years,
going to be
that's
falling
become
out.
very, very controversial. And I didn't realize, because obviously I wasn't fortunate enough to be reading those books off the newsstand. So years later, when I would read the letters pages, oh my word, the fans were ripping Jack. And and I was surprised that the editors were like allowing these letters to go through. And they're like, "Well, Jack, what are you doing? When's someone else going to appear?"
Well, the present 20th century phenomenon of Jack being an icon, absolute icon in comics, that was not true in the 70s, because I was there and I would hear people badmouth Kirby. Comics professionals badmouth Kirby. The general belief seemed to be that he couldn't write. And so it's sort of like wonderful irony that now things like Devil Dinosaur are considered classics.
Yes.
Go ahead now.
Yeah, so you've done a lot of the kind of resource books and history and things. Did you ever get the itch though to jump on a series? Were you getting the urge that you wanted to actually write for these comic books? No,
because it's being a creative writer is a different talent than being a researcher and scholar. Mm-hmm. I'm a researcher and scholar. Now, Mark Grunwald, who was an amazing person, was both. Yes. He was a writer, he was an editor, but I think the reason we got along so well is, now there's a whole side of Mark I didn't see much of. You'll see Mark, other people who were involved with the handbook, like Mike Carlin and Elliot Brown, go on and on about practical jokes that he did and things like that. I saw a more serious side of Mark. I saw the scholarly side. I think he realized that I thought the way he did, because remember, he originated the handbook and I carried on doing it in his style. He recognized me as a kindred spirit. So, I don't have the imagination to come up with stories. I'm a critic. I'm a historian. I'm a researcher. On the other hand, I have at times written backup comic book stories that deal with comics history. And that proved to pay off creatively. One series I did over 30 years ago now. Mark did a series of annuals in Avengers books called the Citizen Kang Saga.
Yes.
And Roy wrote the first of those. Yeah. And Mark asked me to do a series of backup stories for these annuals tracing Kang's history, which is really convoluted, as you know, because he was also favorable with Todd. He was a Centurion. He was Immortus.
Yeah.
Kurt Busiek tried to do a summation of Kang's history later on in Avengers Forever, and his is somewhat different than mine. But I did the first attempt. And in the course of this, so I wrote these backup stories. I also did a series called Saga of the Serpent Crown for the backs of the Avengers Atlantis Attacks.
Yes, Atlantis Attacks.
And in many of those cases, I'm just retelling old stories. In other cases, I'm making stuff up to fill gaps.
Yeah.
And now this is over 30 years ago, so I don't recall who had the original idea for this. But I was the one who got to do the story in which the character was introduced, and that was Victor Timely, another one of Kang's identities who operated around the turn of the century. He was like a competitor to Edison and to Tesla, but he was secretly bringing futuristic technology into the early 20th century, and one of his students was Professor Phineas T. Horton, and you see where this is leading. So that because I figured that Horton could not possibly have come up with all the discoveries and inventions that would be needed to create an android like the Human Torch all by himself.
Yes.
And Kang's motivation was
that's cool.
The reason why Kang keeps attacking the 20th century, or now the 21st, over and over again is because he sees himself as this great warrior and he wants to pit himself against the legendary superheroes of that time. So, of course, he would go back in time before the superheroes and instigate the creation of the very first Marvel superhero to set the age of heroes in motion. Wow. So anyway, so I'm the one who introduced Victor Timely. I consider myself his co-creator for that reason, because I wrote the original story. That established his backstory. Even though there was, in the earlier annuals in that series, there were like a little hints that Victor is coming, and like the town of Timely, Wisconsin. And so, wow, was I surprised when I was watching the third Ant-Man movie, and at the post-credits sequence, we have Victor Timely show up.
Yeah.
And then he becomes a major character in the second Loki TV streaming series. Now, unfortunately, because of the Jonathan Majors scandals, I don't know. For all I know, Marvel is planning to write Kang out in all of his other identities. I don't know.
He's gone.
I would rather that they just recast Kang. Because Kang is a character I obviously like. I wrote that backup series stories about him. But it was very pleasing to see my name in the credits for Marvel Studios project.
I think I mentioned something
I never would have expected.
Yeah, I think I mentioned something online. I said, I think I tagged you and I said, there you are, Peter. I did that. Yeah, it was cool to see you and all that and celebrate it too. And I was happy for that. And yeah, talking about Kang, I loved him too. I especially loved, I think Steve can agree to me here, that Incredible Hulk issue that Roy wrote, the Time Storm, and the Hulk is underneath all those. Oh, that was such a good issue. The
best thing that Roy did with Kang was the original Grandmaster story.
Oh yes,
that is a highlight of Kang's history in comics. And I hate the fact, by the way, that Marvel Studios turned the Grandmaster into this dopey comedy character played by Jeff Goldblum. Because I once dressed up as the Grandmaster for Halloween. That was Mark's idea again. He came up with the costume and made me up with the blue makeup and the wig. So I like the Grandmaster too.
So I wanted to, especially for the people who are watching this show, I wanted to lay some context here just on the sheer amount of importance that your work, combined, of course, with Mark Grunwald and, of course, under the umbrella of Jim Shooter, was...
No, not so much Shooter's umbrella. I can tell you what Shooter's role with it was.
Well, according to legend, maybe you can correct me, it was Jim Shooter's original idea to do a guidebook, and then Mark ran with it. Is that correct?
Not really. It was Shooter's original idea to do a series of superhero trading cards that would be like baseball trading cards, and they have statistics like height and weight on the backs, just like baseball cards do.
Oh, okay.
And Mark came up with that idea and said, well, he gave Mark that idea, and Mark said, well, I want to do it differently. I want to do an encyclopedia of the Marvel Universe. And so that's how it evolved.
Ah, okay. Okay, good. Well, that's definitely, I mean, that's breaking news here, because that has never been revealed before. Because
I never knew that either.
In the last interview that I read from Jim Shooter, he explained how he had seen a reference book on military vehicles and thought it'd be a great idea to have an encyclopedia. So obviously now we know it was Mark's idea. Well,
this is my understanding from what people have told me.
Yeah.
Now I don't know. It may well be that Shooter has forgotten this, that it was originally his trading card idea, or I don't know. I mean, it is after all 40 years ago.
Yes, yes. And
but
specifically,
I've always known the trading card story.
Now, when it comes to, of course, 40 years ago, and everyone always talks about how good things are today. In my humble opinion, when it comes to pure information laid out properly in an entertaining and academic fashion, nothing can get close, especially to the second volume of the Official Handbook of the Marvel Universe, the Deluxe series.
Mm-hmm.
That was the height. Now, luckily enough, I think number one came out like January 1985. And at the time, I was able to pick up issue 1 of that, also issue 1 of the Marvel Saga. And then, of course, about a month later, issue 1 of the official Marvel Index to the Amazing Spider-Man,
which was done by George Olszewski.
Yes, and that goes on to my next question. I'm a huge George Olszewski maniac, and I have all of his fanzines. I have all of the original Marvel indexes that he did. And what I'm curious about is, how much input did you have with him in regards to, getting the actual placings and the continuity and the before and after appearances correct? Because he was getting to a level where, he was talking about artifacts, devices, and locations. He was getting pretty hardcore.
Well, I had no connection with George. I never met him. I'm sorry I never did. But I did use his research as a source for some things. But what comes to mind is that when I was writing Marvel Saga, and the idea of Marvel Saga was to put all the events in Marvel history, starting with Fantastic Four #1, in chronological order. Yeah. And as it turned out, that we got canceled, sooner than I would have hoped, so that we ended up ending with the Galactus trilogy, which was a good way to end. And putting the events in early Marvel stories into chronological order is not as easy as you'd think, because there would be, for example, you'd have a year where Thor just went from one adventure nonstop into another. And meanwhile, there's all these Avengers stories going on in single issues or two-parters. So when Thor stops by Avengers Mansion, well, when exactly is that happening?
Yes.
I remember, for example, Thor leaves the Avengers when, Iron Man and Giant Man and the Wasp do, and he doesn't return, at least according to the original continuity, until I remember the scene. Stan Jack have him coming into Avengers Mansion saying, "Who are you guys?" Because it's Hawkeye, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver. But in the meantime, he's at all these Avengers. So this took it was a real effort to try to figure this out chronologically. Now, Olszewski had already figured some of this out, but I had to figure out a whole lot more. And I ended up working out a day-by-day calendar.
Wow.
For what would happen, what Marvel stories happen on which day of the year. And So George's research was a help, but that was a big effort for me.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it's like nope. Now I think if you tried to do that now, I think the idea that the characters have probably since 1961 aged 10 years tops, and you have to fit 60 years into that. I think probably now it would be impossible. And now, for example, Marvel keeps doing these series that are supposed to have happened in between old Silver Age stories, and it's like it would just be a mess if you tried to figure it out chronologically.
Yes, and as
like for example, the original X-Men as teenagers journeying into the present day, and then going back.
Yeah, well, I think, and maybe you'll.
Oh, how do I work in all this century stuff?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the flashbacks and continuity implants are annoying enough. But for me, the great schism that occurred was in Iron Man, when they changed the origin without any explanation. For many, many years, Iron Man's origin had been the same. John Byrne came along and, took it away from Vietnam and said, but it was an Asian conflict. So we had that. And then under Warren Ellis, without any explanation, suddenly it was Afghanistan. And
there's several things to say about this. One is that, well, obviously, the way Marvel time works is that, it's always everything from FF #1 is basically within 10 years. Or I don't know if the current management at editorial management at Marvel even thinks in these terms. But for me, it was like, I think when I was there in the 80s, it was like everything happened within 7 years. So now I'd say probably 10. Peter Parker was 15 when he became Spider-Man, and I don't want to think of him and Mary Jane being older than 25, really. And if you look at this, I mean, you'll find all sorts of like how the Power Pack kids growing up in that time. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. People aren't paying attention. When Mark was there, people paid attention to trying to keep continuity straight.
Yes,
but it's like, now it doesn't bother me that the origin is in Afghanistan in the movie. The movies have their own continuity.
Yes,
it's sort of a surprise that Byrne decided to update it to, make it a war in Asia. I can say Byrne is really usually a stickler for continuity, even though, of course, when he got to DC, he just jettisoned everything that ever happened to Superman. So he's a man of contradictions. But I think that what he was probably thinking was, okay, don't mention the Vietnam War specifically because that's too far back in time. Just say it's a war in Asia.
Yes.
I think the best solution was what Kurt Busiek came up with in the they introduced, maybe it was Mark Waid or Kurt Busiek together, because I think I first read this in the History of the Marvel Universe series that Mark Waid wrote, and then Kurt Busiek used this in his The Marvels series, and they came up with this fictional Asian country, and that now takes place of Vietnam in Marvel continuity. It's this fictional Asian country that had a war at some point in the past, and that's where the Punisher the original Punisher served in the army, and that's where Iron Man had his origin, and that works for me. George Ossowski used to refer to, in his indexes, to topical references, like if President Johnson turned up in a story, he said, okay, that's a topical reference because it wouldn't fit Marvel time.
Yes.
So I regard Vietnam in the original Iron Man origin as a topical reference. It was a war in Asia, and Mark and Kurt solved the problem by making it this fictional country.
Yes. So that means that obviously Nixon didn't, meet the leader and the Hulk.
Well, it means that Nixon wasn't the head of the secret empire, although now I like the idea of Donald Trump being the head of the secret empire in Marvel time, since it has to be brought up towards the 21st. So that Englehart story from the 70s now has to be set in the early 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I remember, I think Mark Waid had Captain America or Steve Rogers meet, President Clinton. So I mean, even that's too far back now. So you can't even use Clinton. So I don't know.
I wonder if you can even use Obama. Pretty soon you won't even be able to use that Spider-Man meeting Obama story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. But then again, you know, when it comes to again, you mentioned a very poignant fact. When you had someone like Mark Grunwald working at Marvel, who was obviously a writer and editor,
Yes.
and continuity cop,
yeah,
you had a level of class and intelligence combined with yourself and combined with others like Roger Stern and those guys, which is a level that I would consider a golden age of knowledge. A golden age where anyone in the Marvel offices or whoever it is, if someone says, oh, yeah, you know, can you remember this issue? Someone goes, yes, Fantastic Four 286. These days,
it's just Tom Brevoort.
Yes. You know, there's just that one person left. And what we have right now is a lack of control, a lack of editors who know what's going on. And I mean,
and there's also a lack of caring about past continuity, which is ironic to me, because we are now living at a time when practically everything from the past of DC and Marvel is in print. And, you know, right behind me, I have Omniverse editions of the Marvel Universe handbooks, but like everything. So it's like the old excuse was, well, you can't, well, you know, way back when people like Len Wein would say that, well, you know, the audience turns over every 2 years, so that's why we can repeat stuff from previous stories, because they don't know about the stuff that happened before that. Well, now, I mean, between getting digital copies online or getting reprint volumes or even getting them seeing old collections at your libraries, you know, all this stuff from the past is accessible. So for me, there's no excuse for violating continuity. But I mean, all the way back in the 80s, there were people who didn't care about past continuity. I remember talking to the assistant editor of Batman in the 80s and saying I was surprised that Frank Miller had done a new origin for the Catwoman in Dark Knight. And he said, Catwoman had an origin? And it's like, all you would have to have done is just ask me or Marv or Len or Bob Greenberger or Nelson Bridwell, and we all would have told you about Catwoman's origin story. And when you mentioned Warren Ellis, without explanation, setting Iron Man's origin in Afghanistan, Warren Ellis would be a person who doesn't care about past continuity. Precisely. The thing is that when DC, one of the bad things about DC in the 1980s, Crisis on Infinite Earths, it was important for DC to do because it was a sign that, okay, we are going to stop being lame, and you know, when we know that the kind of stuff we're doing in the 50s and 60s and 70s is outdated now. We know we've been trying to do weak imitation Marvel. Now we're going to go in brand new directions and revitalize the company, which they did. But by jettisoning so much continuity from the past, they set the signal that none of this matters. And DC has continued to reboot and revamp and revise and retcon continuity ever since. And this is basically taken over the mindset of an awful lot of creators. And I think it is a miracle that Marvel basically still has intact continuity going back to 1961. I mean, I think, for example, that when we had what I think of as the great disaster, when we had all the downsizings at Marvel that claimed so many people in the 90s.
Yes.
And Bill Jemas came in.
Oh.
And
oh God.
And he started the ultimate. He sold the ultimate Marvel line to start continuity over again. I thought at the time, well, at least he didn't do a DC and just say all the past stories never happened. We're going to start over from scratch. He instead created his own Earth 2 and put them all there. And I thought at the time, this isn't going to last, and it didn't. good things that came out of the Ultimate line were Miles Morales, which is a good idea, and now he's a movie star, and the idea that a revamped Nick Fury would look like Samuel L. Jackson. That's it.
Yeah. Well, you know,
but I mean, so it's like, yeah, it's one of the reasons why I find it hard to care about anything at DC anymore, because I know that I just wait a few years and it'll be changed again.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but I think
Go ahead, Steve. You were going to say something?
Yeah, I think it's also important to, explain to people that, if they want to get firsthand information about certain characters and history and artifacts and devices, when you go online, and you go to, there's 5 billion fan sites and they're ripping the information off as much, and then they're trying to add some stuff.
And they don't have editors. They don't have anyone to supervise them, to tell them when they're making mistakes.
Precisely. Yeah. So you have to go back to the source material. And I think, and luckily enough, and I think at some point we're going to be speaking with the guys that organize the omnibuses. Someone at Marvel does have a little bit of savvy, because they went forward and they produced the omnibus editions for Volume 1 of the Official Handbook Universe, Volume 2, and Volume 3. So I've been a heavy pusher of that material, because I'm still not an online person. I don't like going around and searching.
I get the feeling that Marvel and DC are basically republishing anything and everything in omnibus format, because apparently there's an audience that can afford this stuff. So I'm glad that they include my projects as among these things. And I will say that I know several of the people who have worked on handbooks, official handbooks of the Marvel Universe, or versions of it in recent decades, and they're good, and they're good and smart people. They work hard at it. There are some things, like they did the Marvel Atlas about all the fictional countries in the Marvel Universe, and another one they did about all the Marvel pantheons of gods in the Marvel Universe, and there's stuff in there that I never even heard of. Between them, these this is like a whole staff, a whole group of people. They also were assisting Mark Waid with his History of the Marvel Universe, which I wish I had been invited to help with, but I wasn't. But anyway, they do remarkable work. But I agree, there's something about the original handbooks of the 80s and the DC books, who's who of the 80s. There's something about the way they were written, about the way they were designed. There's still something special.
Yes.
Yeah. I actually want to go into that, Peter. I remember my uncle, he had a variety store, and they would get the comics in there. And I remember the Marvel Handbook, from the first series, the one happened to be with the Hulk, that the H through J. And I have to admit, like when I remember there was like tennis courts across the street, and I never saw anything like that. It just happened to be that issue, and reading that, it was so radical. It was so fulfilled. I loved it so much. I mean, it was seriously like, it was one of the, it was like, when you read a comic and you look at a panel or a page, it was unbelievable. But this was so different. It was like, you never saw that, you never knew that you could do that with the Marvel superheroes.
The subtext of the Official Handbook was that, I think there's something, Mark and I didn't actually say this to each other, but I think we both believed it, that the subtext was that comic book stories are literature. This is important. It is important to trace the history of these characters, of this fictional universe, that this isn't just forgettable, disposable junk.
Yes.
And I think that as decades have passed, and comics, not just the comics medium, but the superhero genre is being taken more and more seriously, I think we are being proven right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, God.
Well, it's like insider information. You read those books, and then you felt like you were very like you go to school the next day and like, did you know? Like it was great source material, and it helped.
I mean, there
understand
must be a reason why Marvel is doing omnibuses of these things, or I also have an omniverse of the Who's Who.
Mm-hmm.
That there must be a market for this stuff. That these things, as you say, it must be that the people still. Maybe it's just nostalgia by old fans, but it's like these things still seem to be readable. They wouldn't keep doing them if that wasn't selling.
Well,
yes,
what
I think, Peter, there has to be an understanding here, and I hope anyone who's watching this understands. There was a series of, Marvel handbooks that began in 2004 and went on, and they made some hardcovers and did some stuff. And what they did was they invited all sorts of people who had been working online for many years and had their own little sites. Some of those people, extremely knowledgeable.
Yes.
Extremely knowledgeable and clever, and was able to spend time going through the last 20 years of continuity, which none of us here could really do without getting a gun.
That's true of me too.
Yes.
Although I do like go on to Amazon to see what the new comics are coming out every week.
Yeah.
So if there's something that I think, oh, this is a continuity change I should know about, I'll buy it.
But when it comes to, and you mentioned it, when it comes to the pleasing format, the deluxe series is the pinnacle, cannot be beaten. And when I showed people the omnibus and I opened it up and they saw the work that you had done when it was like 3 pages, and it's beautifully explanatory, and they had to make some changes. They shorten stuff in. So what we have is this product. That's why Marvel are printing it, because it still works today. When they go here and they read all the stuff about the Red Skull, they didn't go in and change all that continuity. That stuff all happened, and you made a notation of it. It's valid today. And I hope and pray that in the higher circles later on, when someone else is coming up with another Marvel movie, those books get handed to people and they can go, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, I wanted to do something about Red Skull.
I'll say something about the original handbooks. It wasn't just, and this is true of the Who's Who as well, it wasn't just the text. It was the fact that they were regarded as showcases for the great artists who worked at both companies. So at DC, for example, if we did a New Gods character, they brought in Jack Kirby to draw him. We got Frank Miller to draw the Daredevil characters and Walt Simonson to draw the Thor characters.
Yes.
And Byrne to draw the Fantastic Four characters. And it was an artistic showcase. And that's another reason why I think there's something special about the handbooks of the 80s. And I will also admit that even though we did lots of research, there were times when there were gaps, and Mark and I would fill in the gaps in continuity. But if I was doing it for the X-Men, I always ran it by Chris Claremont. Or Thor for Walt Simonson, or Daredevil for Walt, or the Fantastic Four for Byrne, who was head of doing the FF at that point. It's like, and of course, Mark had to oversee everything. So that, for example, the history of the Subterraneans and the 4 different races.
Yes.
That's me knitting together all these 4 underground races, but I'm the one who basically knit them together. And I'm the one who dubbed them the Molians and so forth.
And Peter, and speaking
for Tyrannus's group, yeah.
Yeah, and Peter, and speaking of the second volume of the Marvel Universe Handbook, Steve, do you remember when they made those almost graphic novels, the first trades of those? Remember they were collected? Those were some of the first time I ever saw
them there.
Yes.
Yeah, they were like for $8.99.
Extraordinarily expensive. Yep. They were like $6.95.
Yeah, that was huge, and I got them, Steve. And that was so hard to get, but I loved the handbook so much that I was like, I cannot pass this up.
Yeah.
And when I saw them collected,
it's such a bad thing, a terrible thing, that by the end of the 80s, Marvel and DC had both basically decided there was no market for this kind of stuff and stopped doing them.
Yes.
They didn't realize how popular they really were. And when you mention giving the copies of the handbooks to the people at Marvel Studios, well, I have this wish this fantasy that someday I'll get a call from Marvel Studios and they'll say they need a consultant. And I'd be willing to be a part-time consultant, but this will never happen. But I keep saying, hey, I saw the Eternals movie. I could have told them where they were going wrong.
Well, yeah, we don't even mention.
And so could Mark Evanier or Neil Gaiman, but they didn't. They don't bother to consult. For the most part, they don't bother to consult comics people.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the main reasons, and again, Niall is extremely connected with modern creators. And the main problem is the young editors that we have now, both at Marvel and DC, who they maybe worked as a barista at Starbucks, and then suddenly they're in charge of books.
Yeah.
They have no idea about continuity. And so someone that of our lineage can come on and read something and see something so basically wrong, and the editor or assistant editor has no clue. And we're like, wait a minute, we remember it different than that.
Probably the story is they think that their demographic that they're aiming at are young people who haven't read the older stuff. But as I keep pointing out, the older stuff is all in print. Marvel and DC keep trying to sell it's the older stuff, reprints of the older stories. And who do you think is buying a lot of the expensive omnibus and other reprints? I mean, the older audience is still there. Part of it is still there too, and with enough money that Marvel and DC are catering to them. So they should pay attention. It's definitely. This has been pointed out about Doctor Who. Doctor Who is a model of how to sustain continuity over 60 years. Mm-hmm. It's basically as old as the Fantastic Four, right?
Yes.
And yet they keep everything in continuity, which means that they can do things like bring back actors who used to play the Doctor years and years ago into new stories, bring back villains from the past. They can, and perhaps more importantly, as far as the BBC is concerned, they can still sell video cassettes of the old shows and have the old shows streaming on streaming services because it's all intact. It's all part of the ongoing continuity.
Mm-hmm. Although, Peter, I don't mean to step on anyone's toes here, being English and being a Doctor Who nut, maybe second only to Dan Slott. They actually did go in there and retcon a lot of history away and have a brand new origin, which caused me to go and get a bottle of bleach and drink the entire bottle. I'm still here somehow.
Please don't drink bleach. But I think that, all right, they probably, all right. You obviously know the continuity better than I do. But I would say, but as far as I know, I'm talking about in general.
Yes.
It's like how many doctors have there been now? 13, 14?
Yeah.
They're 13. All part of this, all part of the history, even if they're retconning details here and there.
Yes. Yes. But then again, this last 2 or 3 years.
For example, I remember seeing like last year, that there's a little bit of an outcry when Russell Davies retconned the origin of Davros.
Believe you me, I drank 4 bottles of bleach when that happened, because what you have there is someone who decided to change continuity because it hurt their feelings. And so basically, when you go back and watch the Genesis of the Daleks from 1975 with Tom Baker, there is Davros, and he's got a Dalek body. When I was a kid and I watched it, I didn't say, oh, he's in a wheelchair. This is anti-wheelchair people. I didn't think that.
Oh, well, what I read when the outcry happened, I saw people saying, no, the problem with this is that people in wheelchairs like to have a villain they could identify with.
Again, someone who changed something, who was in a position of power, and changed something with feelings. That's about happening at Marvel and DC right now. And unfortunately, we don't have a program where editors seem to be tested for their abilities. If someone comes in as an editor, if I was to go work at DC, I'd be fired on day one, because someone could ask me a basic question about what happened in New 52, and I'd be like, I didn't read any New 52. Out the door. Same thing should happen to anyone who works as an editor. They better know their stuff, because otherwise they will say all sorts of things.
Well, I will point out that Mark Grunwald ran assistant editors classes and even compiled an assistant editor's handbook to teach them how to be editors. And for years, I've been asking his widow, Catherine, if she can find a handbook and if we can somehow get the rights to print it so that everybody can read this.
Wow.
Heck, I'd like to read it.
Yes.
That would be great. Wow.
So
Yeah.
Jump on that bandwagon.
but that's the thing about being my age now. It's like you mourn the good old days, but then again, I think of it as holding on to standards.
Yes.
Yes.
Although
Yes,
I also
exactly.
use another analogy. You know, there's this part of archaeology which says that, you know, before 10,000 BC, the technology and the knowledge was better, but it just got lost. And here we are. We have an example of it where the publication, the format was better than it is now. And hence, that's why they keep reprinting it. And that's why people like Roy Thomas keep getting a lot of money because of they're reprinting all his material. It's going to keep going on because the modern stuff does not equate to the same level.
No.
So when I talk about creators' names, I talk about Mark Grunwald, you know, I talk about Peter Sanderson, I talk about Murray Ward, I talk about, you know, all of these guys, George Olszewski, they're at a level that's untouchable by anyone today. I don't mean to be harsh, just my humble opinion.
Well, I think if we are going to take comics and superhero comics seriously, we have to admit that there is such a thing as classics, great works that are timeless. And so you don't reject the past. You go through it and you learn and appreciate the great material that was done in the past. And I think one reason that probably one reason why Marvel has held on to its continuity basically for 60 years, despite a retcon here and there, is that the brilliance of the stuff that Stan and his collaborators did in the 60s and that people like Roy did in the 70s, that it has such enduring power that I think people don't dare want to overturn it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just hope that they keep thinking that way.
Wow, that's great. And Peter, in ending, we got to end it off here, but that's a great thing to say. But Steve, any last words to Mr. Sanderson?
You know, it has been a great show, and I'm hoping and praying that anyone who's watching this show will investigate if they haven't ever investigated those pieces of work, the sheer amount of quality and research and the magnificence of it has to be showcased. And I tell you, I shout to the rooftops every day about that product because that's the product that made me what I am today. And
he does.
And I am extremely thankful to you, Peter, and all of your ilk, because without you, there would be no me, and there would probably be maybe no MCU. So I tip my hat to you, and it's been an extraordinary honor to speak to you today.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, same here. No, it's an honor. I appreciate the work you've done. You know, I have my handbooks as well. I love them. You know, as an artist, for me too, I love the art that was in those. You know, it kind of helped me really work on my anatomy and everything, as well as the knowledge that, you know, my friends didn't have. But one thing I wanted to ask is, you know, doing such in-depth work, were you given access to like secret vaults of knowledge where you could get and compile all of this stuff for these books, or were you on your own?
No. I mean, before we leave, I also should credit Elliot Brown, who did a lot of the technical diagrams and the technical explanations of how superpowers and super weapons work.
Yes.
That was another thing that was distinctive about the original handbooks.
Yes.
But no, I mean, when I was writing the Who's Who and the Marvel Universe handbooks, I had access to the company's libraries. Marvel's library was terrible. Now it's different because I think they've digitized virtually everything, so they've got digital copies of everything. But back then, it was like there were volumes that were missing. There's only one copy of whatever they had. Whereas DC always did it really well. They had like 2 copies of everything bound up through 1948. And after that, they had 3 copies of everything. So I had access to the libraries. I had access to people, comic writers and writers who are my friends, who I could call up and ask about the characters they were writing. But apart from that, no secret troves of information. And like I said, occasionally Mark and I would make things up out of our imaginations. And if the people in charge of those characters approved, they became part of Marvel legend.
Very cool.
Yeah, and Peter, I got to say, like, I can remember being on that tennis court, opening up that first issue, and it blew me away. And I collected the Marvel Saga too. I got every single one. I got it because I'll never forget that because it was so radical too. Those
I
issues,
would love it if Marvel wanted to do the Marvel Saga.
There's significant.
I would love it if the Marvel wanted to do the Marvel Saga again, and they probably would not invite me because most of the people at Marvel don't even know who I am anymore. But I would love to do it. And this time, my favorite part of the Marvel Saga was when we got artists to do new material for it, which was very rare. But like we got Bill Sienkiewicz to do some pages, had Ron Friends do a sequence. Yeah. And this time I would bring in new artists to do scenes from these classic stories. I would love it if that happened again, but probably won't.
Did you like when you saw it in an omnibus edition? Remember they made the Marvel Saga in an omnibus? That must have been a pretty.
I
cool
like
treat.
that, and I have a copy of that one too.
Yeah, that was. I never thought you would see that.
These things.
Yeah, I'm glad you get it. So
yeah, all that stuff now is on people's bookshelves, and of course, again, it's the quintessential version of whatever it is for a new. For a new Marvel Saga, whew, I mean, there's been 6,000 billion flashbacks and continuity implants right there. They would have to be...
Mark Waid's history of the Marvel Universe is sort of like a Marvel Saga, except that he doesn't try to put individual stories in order. But then again, maybe at this point with so much more Marvel history, maybe that would be impossible. I don't know. It'd be interesting to try.
Yes.
But Peter, thank you for everything. Thank you for coming on, and thank you. You're a legend, man. You really are, and you really impacted. You really impacted me and Steve especially. I know Nal got in there too, but God, it was so radical, and I'm glad that we got to talk to you about that because hey, next time you pick up an Overstreet, you can see Steve. You'll see all your work in there because he's so influential to him, and I love it. So Steve, why don't you get us out of here? Well, Mighty Mystic Milner. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on Pop XP. If you haven't already, make sure to click that subscribe button and also click the bell for notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. Also, don't forget to head on over to Twitter and follow us at the Pop XP and over on Instagram at the Pop XP. Thanks again everyone, and we'll see you soon.